I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show.
You are a blasphemous scumbag, pervert, freako, lunatic. You're out of here.
Wally George, Remembering the Hot Seat, Saturday at 8 on LA 56.
And now, David, oh boy, we got him here tonight. David, introduce our first guest.
I don't know whether to introduce these guys or to run out of here screaming. But anyway, this is a gothic rock group called Radio Werewolf.
Now, your name is, hold it down, hold everybody. Your name is
Nikolas Schreck.
Nikolas Schreck. You know, I've investigated you guys, and I have found out that these
I'm
maniacs
surprised if you could investigate anything, George.
Oh, listen to this one. I have discovered, I've had other bands and groups on my show, but I've discovered these vermin are the most vile, evil group I've ever seen, ever.
Flattery will get you nowhere.
Hey, look at their literature.
Silence, you miserable cretins. Silence!
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. What you just heard was a clip from a talk show called The Hot Seat, hosted by the late Wally George. If you're unfamiliar with Wally George, he was a fixture on TV and radio in Southern California throughout the 1980s into the 1990s, and his whole shtick was being a raucous conservative firebrand who'd get into the most outrageous and over-the-top shouting matches with liberal elitists and other sickos and freaks, as he would call them, including Satanists and, God forbid, proponents of marijuana legalization, who he would duel with until inevitably he'd kick him out of the studio, yelling, "You're out of here," to the cheers of the audience in attendance. You really should look up some clips of The Hot Seat with Wally George, because it's just surreal. I mean, there is a sort of carnival-esque atmosphere and aura to the whole thing. It's wild. But Wally George, and you can probably tell this from the description I've given of his show, The Hot Seat, was sort of a precursor to talk shows like The Jerry Springer Show and media figures like Glenn Beck, Bill O'Reilly, now today maybe someone like Ben Shapiro or Charlie Kirk. Of course, I see a lot of Wally George in the debate bro culture on YouTube, specifically the sort of blood sport debates, as they're called on YouTube. That's a whole genre in and of itself on YouTube that I think reminds me, at least, of Wally George. And of course, others have drawn parallels between Wally George and Donald Trump. In fact, Talking Points memo in 2016 referred to Wally George as the archaeo-Trump. And obviously the main parallel between the two is that both have a very vulgar combative style that propelled them into popularity. We're going to be talking about that on this edition of the show and a lot more. It's going to be a rather wide-ranging conversation. It won't just be about Wally George, but also the sort of vulgar showbiz stylings of the modern Republican Party. And we'll be doing that with someone you heard before the intro in that very clip that I played. I'm talking about Nikolas Schreck of the cult death rock band Radio Werewolf. Nikolas was a multi-time guest on the hot seat with Wally George, and he's going to give us some insights into the parallels between Wally George and Donald Trump. We'll also discuss his experiences with Wally George, the differences he sees between Wally George and Trump, and we'll also delve into his experiences as someone who lived through the Satanic Panic, because Nikolas was a practicing occultist involved with the Church of Satan. He was even married to Zena LaVey, the daughter of Church of Satan founder Anton LaVey. So we're going to be delving into the Satanic Panic on this edition of the show as well, specifically the ways in which Nikolas sees parallels between the Satanic Panic and the phenomena of QAnon. So all that and much more on this edition of the show. I should note that Nikolas and I come from rather different worldviews, but I think he has a great deal of insights when it comes to Wally George, the Vulgarian sort of appeal of Wally George and Donald Trump, the sort of showbiz nature of modern GOP politics, and also, having lived through the Satanic Panic, I think he has a great deal of insight about QAnon. So, regardless of politics, I think he has a lot to say and a lot of insights to offer on topics related to the Trumpian age we're in. And I hope you'll get a lot out of this conversation. With that being said, let's get to the conversation with Nikolas Schreck. On this edition of Parallax Views, we're going to be looking back at the career of a Southern California original who can only be described as, the consummate showman, but also, a very interesting figure politically in light of the age of Donald Trump. And the figure I'm talking about is the father of combat television, Wally George. For those that don't know, he was sort of a precursor to Jerry Springer and even Morton Downey Jr. They were sort of contemporaries, but I believe Wally was around first. And he was a fixture in Southern California TV. He was known as Mr. Conservative. His show was sort of outlandish. Wally George owns the Libs, very proto-Trump in a lot of ways. And I have the perfect guest to talk about Wally George, a man who was probably one of the most popular guests on Wally George's The Hot Seat, or at least one of his most infamous guests, Nikolas Schreck of Radio Werewolf. How are you doing, Nikolas?
I am doing fine this rainy night in Berlin. Thank you for having me, and let's make Parallax View great again.
So, Nikolas, I gave my sort of assessment of Wally George, sort of this mix of showman and also the modern American conservative, or some such, the ultimate Reaganite. How would you describe Wally George, though?
Well, I've given him a lot of thought in recent years, especially since the anomalies of 2016. And I've been interviewed a few times about him. During this whole process of what's been going on politically, socially, and culturally in the United States. So yeah, I've contemplated and reflected on how much of a pioneer of what's happening in the United States he was. First of all, I think he began a general trend. It's a very odd contradiction considering that Republicans generally, and quote conservative, right wing, if you want to use those phrases for that persuasion, their outer propaganda is that they hate entertainment, they hate Hollywood, they hate show business. Those are decadent libs, satanic pedophiles, depraved cultural destroyers. And yet, Ronald Reagan, who was Wally George's great hero, was completely a spawn of Hollywood. He couldn't be more central to Hollywood and everything it stood for. Something we've touched on in a previous interview, Ronald Reagan was basically brought into politics by Sidney Korshak, the mafia fixer who ran Hollywood, and Lou Wasserman, the head of Universal Studios. So to begin to approach the Wally George phenomenon, you have to look at Ronald Reagan. Even though Wally began his act even before Reagan, really, even before Reagan became prominent. So that's a strange thing, is that despite claiming to despise Hollywood, television, entertainment, culture in general, they see that as an immoral and decadent force, the great communicator, the Gipper, couldn't have been more Hollywood. And so it was with Wally. He wanted to be a rock and roll musician. I got to know him, fairly well after I appeared on his television show twice and on his radio show once. So and we got to know each other, and we were friendly, actually, despite our completely oppositional views. But Wally began as a would-be rock and roll singer. He was very tied into the music industry of Los Angeles. He was like a promoter and presenter of concerts going back to the early 60s. He knew people in show business. His daughter, famously, is Rebecca De Mornay, the actress, though he became estranged from her. And he was basically an entertainer. I mean, you couldn't call him a deep political thinker. He was an entertainer. He was a showman. And the people that came to his show and the people that tuned in religiously to watch him, whether they agreed with him or didn't agree with him, watched him for the entertainment. And he was, he played a role. To a certain degree, he was that role, but he definitely, there was as I pointed out before, an aura of professional wrestling to it as well, in which he was playing a character. And obviously, he was so much although he was a far more decent person, I believe, and a more moral person than the stable genius, he certainly is a bizarrely similar predecessor to, a less virulent form of the Donald, down to his bizarre hair, his clothing, his manner, he pretty much devised insult TV. Maybe the only other competitor was Joe Pine, who was another talk show host a little before him. But
I was going to say, not to interrupt you, but I always tell people, people know Wally George now, or if they don't know Wally George, they know Morton Downey Jr., but really Joe Pine was doing it before everyone.
Right. Yeah. Joe Pine was, if for your younger listeners, was an insult hot seat talk show host, even going into the early 60s. And I think Wally must have been influenced by him. But, Wally was far more ideological. But the thing is, Reagan, and Wally George in the 80s, the Republican Party really was subsumed by this show business performer attitude. And, and literally they were performers. Ronald Reagan was an actor, and he was literally, he was a straw man for Sidney Korshak and Lou Wasserman and corporate interests. He had been on Death Valley days, so he was a very popular and familiar face to Americans watching him on TV, exactly as I believe Donald Trump's popularity has a great deal to do with his popularity on The Apprentice. So there's a lot of similarities there, and basically I think America's political understanding is so crude and vulgar and unsophisticated in general that they prefer entertainment to in-depth political substance. They're not really interested in governance. They're interested in being entertained. And Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris don't really have snappy one-liners, and that wasn't good enough. This is more entertaining. And I mean, there's a lot more to it, which we can discuss. But I think that's part of the appeal of Reagan, George, Trump, is that they are entertainers. They're not, and also they appeal to the cruelty of their audience. Ronald Reagan was a little bit more nuanced, but people liked to, even when he was governor of California, they liked his one-liners insulting hippies, insulting liberals, and he had a certain Irish wit and had a good, he could be a good comedian. He told jokes well.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I don't know if you know of him, but I have a friend who produced TV back in the 60s and 70s by the name of John Barbour. And
Yes,
he interviewed Reagan. Yeah, John's from Real People. But he interviewed Reagan, and one of the things he noted was that Reagan would just pull out these one-liners and pithy statements, and he wouldn't debate. He would just kind of brush you off, and people ate it up.
Right. Well, I mean, the moment with Jimmy Carter, yes, exactly. But America's is so used to, a culture reared on I Love Lucy and the Honeymooners and the sitcom format. Americans tend to think in one-liners and witty comebacks and repartee. And, it's generally assumed that Reagan won the election when he said to Jimmy Carter, "Well, there you go again." I mean, just these little catchphrases, that's what replaces depth and substance in American politics. And, and Trump, though he certainly can't be called witty, and I think compared to Reagan, neither great intellects by any means, but they like the insult. I think the Americans said that the same people that sat there and cheered for Wally George, they loved Ronald Reagan's insulting of liberals, and there's an element of sadism and cruelty, and that seems to be what appeals to them. Of course, with Trump, the ideology and the supposed self-righteous Reformation of America gives you the right to make fun of spastics or, of anybody. That seems to me, I mean, there's a lot more to it, but on as comparing it to Wally George, his audience just, they didn't care what his ideology was. They loved him calling people idiots and insulting them and throwing them off. And that's the primitive level of Reaganism and today of Trumpism. And it's just it's like an advanced version of the same disease that began with Reagan. Although, you could go further back and even see antecedents in Barry Goldwater's campaign of 64.
I wanted to add to that because I'd like your thoughts on this. And I don't know if you've tackled it before or given it much thought, but I feel as if, it's almost insulting for me to call Wally George a conservative, even though that was sort of his shtick. He was Mr. Conservative. I don't even like calling Trump a conservative. Like, to me, a
Right.
conservative is someone
No,
like,
Trump is not a conservative. No,
right. Well, what I was gonna say is, to me, the people that represent, if there's a conservative tradition, I would look at someone like an intellectual like Russell Kirk. To me, these people like Trump and Wally George are just so crude and just uncouth, and I use the word debased. And I'm not trying to be like over the top, but it's very anti-intellectual and it's off-putting to me, and I don't find it very conservative at all.
I agree with you totally. I mean, I would consider myself, although people may be surprised, probably extremely conservative in the true sense of the word, in that I am a traditionalist with a capital T, but that means connected to Europe, as far as I'm concerned, to Western civilization, to European values of chivalry, of knightliness, of honor, of dignity. And, Trump and Wally George certainly do not represent those values, exactly as you say, their vulgarity, their debased nature, their incoherence, even. And yeah, I see conservatism as being rooted in a certain intellectualism. Whether you like him or not, let's say another figure in American thought, William F. Buckley. I mean, that he was a conservative, absolutely, but he was well read, educated, and coming from a European tradition, whether you like it or not. I mean, he was kind of a grotesque entertainment figure as well, but you know, there this I don't know what to call. I can't even call them right wing. Is Trump really right wing? I don't think so. He appeals to that base, but just in the same way, I find it hard to think of the Democratic Party as particularly left wing. I mean, the Democratic Party in America, the few Democratic candidates who have won have been Republican light for many years. Obama, Clinton, they've had to be very centrist and not at all left wing. Someone like Bernie Sanders, who is at least mildly social democratic and could be compared to what the word left wing used to mean in historical context, has no place in the Dem. So, are either of them left or right? That's another question. But I agree. There is no impulse to conserve anything in Donald Trump's incoherent, flailing pseudo ideology. Merely, I mean, it's almost anarchic, really, and anarchy is not conservative.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and I want to get back to Wally George, but it's interesting you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
William F. Buckley, because I know a few people that try to argue that it was the debates between Buckley and Gore Vidal that
Gore
led to this
Vidal,
era
yeah.
of combat TV. What do you make of that? Because in a weird way, I think this is rooted even further back than that. I think there's sort of a carny tradition in America, if you will, that, you know, has been around since probably the founding.
Yeah, I think one of the great American figures is the snake oil salesman showing up, and setting up a tent in the middle of town and giving an incoherent speech to get the marks and the rubes to buy some useless product. And now it's gold sneakers and autographed Bibles and, other gewgaws and gadgets. Yeah, I P.T. Barnum is the ultimate American, and I would say L. Ron Hubbard, Joseph Smith of the Mormons, con men, you know, con men selling a product, and I see Donald Trump in that tradition, which and this is something we were going to get into. Um, I think people calling him a fascist or even a national socialist is absurd. He is definitely more part of this con man American figure, snake oil salesman. I think he has so many similarities to L. Ron Hubbard. And, somebody said QAnon is Scientology for trailer parks. And I think there's a lot of comparisons, even physically, even in the bizarre way they both talk. There's a lot of ways you could compare Scientology to MAGA. Even in their wish to go back to some idealized 50s that never existed.
Could you speak a little bit more to that? I hadn't thought of the Scientology sort of parallels.
Well, particularly the QAnon element of the MAGA movement is very much like Scientology, and just when the stable genius invokes a supposedly great America that once existed, it's the same America that L. Ron Hubbard evoked of the this imaginary 1950s when everything was perfect. And just the lying, the blatant lying that L. Ron Hubbard and Trump both do, never admitting any mistake, their infallibility, and they're just making up sheer bullshit, and Scientologists and MAGA people uncritically accepting whatever they said. So I see Trump as part of that tradition of the great American con man. And if you look at politics, he's more like a figure like Boss Tweed, who I'm
Tammany
sure very
Hall.
few people remember, but cast. Yes, the corruption, just the blatant bribery and paying off, and the acceptance of that kind of corruption is part of American thought. Like, well, if it makes money, it's good. But if people look up Boss Tweed, I think he's a lot more like Trump than Benito Mussolini or Adolf Hitler. And I think those comparisons are as ridiculous as, when Republicans and MAGA people call Biden or Harris communists or Marxists, which they are nothing of the kind, even remotely, So I think those words, those propaganda smear words, communist, Marxist, fascist, Nazi, should not be included in this conversation at all. I mean, Trump is certainly an authoritarian, but so was Pol Pot, so was Idi Amin, so was there have been many authoritarian leaders. That is not the same thing as fascism or Nazism, which are specific systems that even had specific economic programs that, certainly fascism and Nazism would condemn Donald Trump, if anything, as a Zionist plutocrat, which is essentially what he is. And the form of government now that with Musk involved with it is an oligarchy, very much like what Putin has, an oligarchy of the incredibly rich, united with the federal government. So I think that's populist oligarchy is more how I would define this phenomenon. But to get back to what you said about Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley, yes, there was an element of theater and confrontative, divisiveness in that very famous debate that they had. But whether you like Vidal or Buckley, the intellectual level that these two men were operating on was 3 million light years away from the vulgarity and stupidity and lack of historical knowledge or understanding of anything that that we currently have in this idiocracy. So I don't really see that. I mean, yes, there was vindictiveness and ugliness, and it was shocking. But 1968 was a year of division and violence, with the Democratic Convention being the disaster that it was. But yeah, there's a certain comparison. But don't you think that Vidal on the left and Buckley on the right were just incredibly more eloquent, intellectual, well-informed, well-read, and they were equal. They respected each other in a way in that they came from the same Europeanized culture. So they were they were coming at it from different approaches, but under the same foundation. That's not the case with what we're dealing with now. The sheer stupidity and ignorance of our current crop of leaders is, I mean, I think that's glaring. Or you think of the eloquence of of Vidal and Buckley's writing, completely different. I mean, who would even understand it now?
No, I agree with that. I think Buckley and Vidal are completely different than, this Trump madness and QAnon style madness that we have now. And one thing I wanted to ask you, when we talk about Wally George, I think a lot of
Hmm.
people like to look back on him and say, oh, it was such an entertaining show and everyone was in on the joke. The audience were frat boys that just wanted a carnival experience. But I think you have a slightly more nuanced view about that. I think you do see a real dark side to it based on your experience.
Absolutely. A lot of people assume, number one, yeah, we should focus on Wally here. People assume that it was all planned, scripted, and theatrical. It was not. None of my appearances on the show, we had a natural. Wally was friendly to me. He actually was trying to support my career by inviting me back. Obviously, he knew, I mean, our Radio Werewolf depended on notoriety. We weren't trying to be liked. We weren't trying to be loved. We were pushing to be the band that was the most hated. That was what we were doing, and he understood that instinctively as a showman, and he helped create that by being our Van Helsing. We needed him to be that as much as he needed us to be the bad guy. So, as far as the dark side of it, those frat boys, they would have hung us if they could. They were not in on the joke. They took it deadly seriously. And it reminded me, I went to a 1984 Ronald Reagan rally. In fact, the last one of that election campaign. And it was the same kind of, class of people there that you saw, the jeering, hateful attitude, the lynch mob attitude of the Wally George audience. I saw that at the Reagan rally too. And of course, you can see it at a MAGA rally today. It really hasn't changed very much. It's just become more virulent, more uglier, more desperate, more hateful. But it was dangerous, and he was rabble rousing, and he was creating a very violent atmosphere. And I don't think he intended to do that, but it was good for ratings, and that's how show business works. But another comparison between, and I think this appeals to the Republican mentality, Trump in his TV show, I mean, both of them are just TV celebrities. That's what they are. What is Trump? Even the producers of The Apprentice admitted they knew he wasn't this, billionaire business genius at all. They created that image for him to make it work on their reality TV show. Just as what were Wally's credentials? Nothing. He was like the right-hand man of the previous Los Angeles mayor, Sam Yorty. He had no political credentials. But the thing I think that appealed to their audiences, again, this is a parallel between Trump and George, is, the stable genius firing people, you're fired, and Wally throwing people off the show. I mean, that's how primitive it is. That's what their base wants, is seeing people thrown off, removed, deleted. That's I think what appeals about both of them. If you can see how similar that was what people waited for, is the moment that guests were thrown off of The Apprentice and Wally George's hot seat. So that's another similarity.
It's interesting. I know he had other guests on where he would debate Satanism, and this is during the sort of heyday of the Satanic panic. And it's funny, I had someone say to me recently, uh, they're enjoying the new slew of, satanic panic themed movies that are coming out, movies that deal with the devil. And I'm like,
Right.
I said to them, but you realize the satanic panic was a real thing. You may have enjoyed, some 80s movie like Trick or Treat, which played on satanic panic and backwards masking records. But, you know, real people got hurt because of the satanic panic. And I think people have forgotten that in some ways. Can you talk about the intersection between the satanic panic and the sort of Reagan Revolution and how real that was? Because I think people have forgotten.
Yeah,
It was very serious.
yeah. Let me address that. I mean, as soon as Ronald Reagan came into office, being an outspoken occultist and black magician, and at that time, now for those who don't know, I've been a tantric Buddhist for most of this century, and before that, in the left-hand path in general. But before that, I, openly identified as a devil worshiper and occultist and made no bones about it in my public career. And with the advent of Reagan, the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, and all of that, the satanic panic was was not fun and games. I didn't want, I think important to stress, it was an interruption of my career. My dream was not to have to debate Bob Larson. That's not something I considered what I wanted to do with my life. We had to do it to defend ourselves against accusations of child sacrifice, of murder. We were harassed by the police. I think I mentioned it on a previous show. The LAPD tried to frame me for a crime. It was extremely serious. And of course, there were many innocent people who were not, outspoken devil worshippers as I was, who were also targeted. And it led to the destruction of many people's lives. The Reagan Bush era and its, the encouragement of born again evangelical Satan stomping, it was a serious thing. It was not fun. I know a lot of people in the satanic world who are too young to remember what it was actually like, look back at it with almost, but it was not fun. And in fact, it was part of I never wanted to live in America, but it was after the satanic panic that I saw the true face of America, which, as I've said before, is the Salem witch hunt. And that's what I see going on now. The satanic panic is back, much more widespread, much deeper than it was then. But, I can't accentuate how serious it was. It was, you had Christian law enforcement, people in the government who were witch hunting, literally. And, if you believe in freedom of religion or any of these Age of Enlightenment claims that the founding fathers based the United States on, that was a turning point. And I don't think we're over it at all. I think QAnon, I have to deal with it every day. You have no idea the nonsense and madness that I'm drawn into. Also people think it's funny that people think Xena and I are Taylor Swift's parents and, part of an Illuminati plot. Yes, it's absurd and grotesque, but the belief systems of the QAnon people and their belief in satanic conspiracies can be rooted directly back to the satanic panic. And, if we thought we had defeated it in the early 90s, well, it's back much more ferociously and much more deeply ingrained in many people's ideas. I experience it all the time. I'm dragged into it constantly, into these conspiracy theories of every kind.
Are you able to talk more about that? Can you give examples? Or I don't want to. If you feel it's too personal, it's fine. But
no, not at all. No, there are basically Christian nationalists and people who are Trump supporters, and QAnon supporters by any other name who believe that I'm part of the Illuminati or the Process Church or the CIA, or that I actually did. You can find it on my YouTube channel. I did a 2-part music video of 2 songs. One is called "They," and another one, "The Nice People." And the first video, "They," I sort of incorporate myself into the conspiracy theory theme of that song. For instance, people take my interviews from or Christians and QAnon types and MAGA types, take the interviews that I gave in, the 80s to Geraldo Rivera, to Tom Metzger's Race and Reason show, to, other interviews which I gave during the Radio Werewolf period. And it's almost become commonly accepted that I was, that part of the Illuminati plan is, I don't know if you know this, that the QAnon people believe that the Illuminati or the lizard people or whatever fucking nonsense they believe, that it's part of some code of honor that we have to announce what we're doing first. So they believe that in those interviews in which I spoke about using symbolism to change consciousness, using music to change consciousness, that we were the predecessors of what they see as the New World Order. I mean, there are hundreds of videos in which I am shown in that context.
Right. This is
so
the whole.
they think.
I was going to say this is the whole. They call it like predictive programming is the big conspiracy theory. Yeah.
Yeah, so they think that the symbolism that Radio Werewolf used, and which I spoke of in these interviews, in the 80s, was part of some master plan to usher. And then, I think people need to look into that predictive programming idea to understand it, is that, there is no fucking Illuminati. You know very well it was a historical phenomenon in Bavaria that died out a long time ago, and it wasn't what these people think it was. I just have to add that in case anyone thinks I'm attributing any validity to it whatsoever.
Well,
but
I was going to say real quick. I mean, the funny thing is, I think your politics would probably be very different. I don't want to speak for you, but I think your politics would be very different than like an Adam Weishaupt who founded this historical Illuminati. In a weird way, they almost, when you read texts about the actual Illuminati, they almost come off as like radical Enlightenment, hyper liberal anarchists.
Absolutely, yes, they were. I would not have ever supported if I was in, Bavaria of the 1800s. I would not support the Freemasonic. I do not support the ideas of the Age of Enlightenment that America is based on, actually. It's one of the many reasons I reject the United States of America, because it is such a child of the Age of Enlightenment. So, yeah, the real Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt was anti-monarchist. I am a monarchist. It was anti-religious. I believe spirituality is crucial. I'm a traditionalist. Classical liberalism is really what the real Illuminati, were arguing for. And I know that that's hopeless, because when I say classical liberalism, ignorant people say, oh, well, they were libtards, pushing trans or whatever bugaboo they fear. Well, that's not true. The Illuminati were a harmless, anti-monarchist, anti-Catholic, absolutely a creature of Rousseau and the Age of Enlightenment, as you said. But that would require some historical knowledge. The history books has nothing to do with this phantasm that QAnon, and I've mentioned this before, it all goes back to the book of Nesta Webster, which I'm sure you're familiar with, about secret societies. All of these ideas go back, hundreds of years, and they're just revamped and also tied into biblical prophecy. But I'm dragged into all kinds of these conspiracies all the time, and the idea that the music industry and that to become a musician you sell your soul to the devil, that Hollywood and The film and music industry are totally tied in to some kind of satanic elite, none of which is true whatsoever. But and even I know by now it's hopeless to say that, because people say, well, of course you would say that, he's covering for them. But that's one of the most prominent things you'll see in QAnon thought, is that these ancient interviews I did for Radio Werewolf were part of an Illuminati plan of predictive programming, which I don't agree. I'm not a liberal, first of all, and I don't support any political party whatsoever. So, but that's it doesn't matter. I've been turned into by those people into this part of their legend, and there's no arguing with it. And I've made some attempt to try to teach critical thinking and reason for people that are actually interested in the truth, but that's a hopeless endeavor. The tide of ignorance is far too great.
Yeah, I wanted to say that's a nice pull there that you made with Nesta Webster's Secret Societies and Subversive Movements is like seminal when it comes to understanding this sort of conspiracy mindset. And it's very interesting to me. I know we've gotten off topic from Wally George, but I want to stick on this.
We got to get back to Wally, definitely. But we can take a digression and then we'll get back to him.
Well, it's very interesting to me because people ask me, they're like, why do you obsess so much about the satanic panics? People will say that to me. And I'll say, because it always comes back. There's always a new iteration of it. And it's not just about Satanism. Because if you listen to these kooks, and I will call them kooks, like Ted Gunderson or a Fritz Springmeier, right, or any of these other conspiracy types, they give lectures where you start to understand the language. They're not even talking about Satanism. To them, as fundamentalist Christians, anything that is not their brand of Christianity is Satanism. They believe that it's the Antichrist spirit. So Buddhism is Satanism to them. Catholicism could be Satanism to them. And even, real quick, I was going to say, a lot of it is just they view secular humanism as Satanism. And it's a very bizarre worldview.
Right. Well, I have been nothing but oppositional to the ideas of the Age of Enlightenment. I think secular humanism is an extremely negative force, and I've made that very clear over and over again. And yet, people assume that yes, exactly right. It's got, first of all, then we get deeper into it, and I try to get into this in my book, The Satanic Scream, and many of my other writings. I've been one of the most ferocious critics of Satanism for decades, because I know it very well. I've seen it from the inside. So I'm not a secular humanist, and I certainly never was when I was a devil worshiper. But yeah, the Gundersons, the William Coopers, the people that were sort of the architects of this QAnonish thinking, Hal Lindsey, who recently died. These are forgotten figures, but they laid the groundwork for this nonsense. To a certain degree, Mae Brussel, who was actually a liberal and kind of a lefty, I think she had a lot to do with some of the ideas of the deep state that QAnon types believe in. A lot of these ideas strangely come from some left-wing conspiracy theories, things that people like Paul Krasner posited, and now they've sort of taken on a populist right-wing twist. But yeah, these things go back to conspiracies in 19th century France. The Toxil hoax, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The idea that there is a satanic elite running the world, it's very old, and it goes back. It goes back to the Middle Ages practically. It just keeps coming back like some herpes sore that just takes on new form and include new figures are the Antichrist. Although, of course, biblical, genuine biblical scholarship pretty much agrees the Antichrist was intended to be something that would have happened shortly after the time of Jesus. It's not something that's supposed to happen 2,000 years later, but that's a historical fine point. We're dealing with madness here. But that's the case, that it has nothing that, first of all, what is Satanism? It's such a loose framework. It's just basically anything that evangelical Christians don't like is satanic. The other thing that's become part of it, which we should touch on later, is the brokenness of men in America. I mean, I think Trump's victory and the same kind of behavior you see in the Wally George audience is very much a fear of emasculation, a desire to be, an alpha male in quotes. And I think that's a big part of it, a misogyny, a fear and suspicion and hatred of women, the whole trad wife fetish. These things, I think, are also a very important thing that unite Reagan, George, and Trump. I don't know if you agree, but I think that is an important part of the whole phenomenon, and that transcends politics. I think a lot of these things have nothing to do with politics anymore as we understand them. They have a lot to do with, look at the speech of Tucker Carlson, which I found amazingly revealing on a psychosexual and psychological level about daddy coming home to punish, the disobedient daughter. That's what this is all about. Did you see that speech?
I've seen a lot of Tucker Carlson's speeches, but I'm not sure I've seen that one, although it doesn't surprise me.
Look that up and maybe even incorporate it into the show, because it's amazing. He's introducing the stable genius like his daddy, and he's saying daddy's coming home, and he's talking about some fictional 16-year-old daughter who's disobedient, and she's going to get a spanking from daddy, and the mostly evangelical Christian audience is cheering about the idea of daddy coming home. And there's something extremely juvenile about, there's a puerile nature of children looking for daddy in the Trump phenomenon. But you got to see that speech. To me, it reveals what's underneath the mask of this claim to be about politics. It really isn't. It's some kind of deeper psychological fracturing going on.
I want to get back to that, but first, I just wanted to note, the only reason I brought up the way in which these sort of Christian fundamentalist figures target secular humanists or Buddhists or anyone that isn't a fundamentalist Christian is because I want to illustrate that point that whether it's you or me, or I've had socialists on this show, people from all kinds of different viewpoints. I feel like this phenomena of MAGA is going after everyone in a lot of ways, and I find that very frightening.
Well, I know it very well from having experienced the Satanic Panic in the 80s, and that was a fundamental reason why I voted with my feet and left the United States. I mean, I have to point out that when I'm commenting on these things, I'm looking at it from a historical point of view and not a partisan political point of view. I neither support the Democrats nor the Republicans nor the whole idea of America. I think America has been a blight on history. I think it was never great. There's nothing about the American dream or the American ideal that I think was positive or good or should be honored. I think it's a failed experiment, like a weird mixture of the Pilgrim Puritanism and the spirit of Salem, as I've said, and then on the other side, the Age of Enlightenment sort of Freemasonic ideas. And I think it's been a catastrophe for the world. So I'm not looking at America as something that can be fixed. I left it, and I think it's ungovernable. But yes, it is frightening, but it is what America is. I mean, the genocide of the Indians, the search for the other to kill. I think it, when liberals say this isn't us, we're better than that. No, that is us. That is America. The Indians were looked at as a satanic force that needed to be wiped out by the good Christian Puritan pilgrims. And that's what America does. It looks for enemies within that are basically diabolical and satanic in one way or the other. Demonizing an internal enemy seems to me the essence of America, and Trump does that very well. And he is America. I mean, nothing about him surprises me. He's not an anomaly. He is, he's like the platonic ideal of the ugly American. So of course, why wouldn't they love him? He's everything that they've ever aspired to be. But yeah, to underscore your point, anyone who cares about freedom of religion or freedom at all should be very frightened by QAnon, who are creating an imaginary enemy, bizarre conspiracy theories about adrenochrome drinking elites. And, look, there already one moron went to look for the basement in Pizzagate with a gun. There is no basement in Pizzagate, but, he's living in a delusion. And I think we're going to see a lot more violence and, based on fantasy. These people who believe they're saving the children, but don't care that in that tape that came out recently, Jeffrey Epstein is saying Donald was my best friend for 10 years. That somehow they don't care about. But they are looking for imaginary children that are somehow being abused by the satanic elite. And, that can own, and they've been emboldened by Trump's second victory to come out of the woodwork. And I see it very clearly. But most Americans will not be frightened by that. They will welcome it because that's what they love. They love to find a demon or an enemy to persecute. That is at the heart of the American experience. And if they can't find an enemy outside, then they will find an internal enemy. I mean, even Trump spoke about the enemy within. And this ties into the Christian basis of MAGA, the evangel. I mean, I have nothing against true Christian mysticism or Gnosticism, but this distorted demiurgic, Christianity of Ealdaboth that Trump represents. I mean, he's not even. It's a joke to even consider him a Christian. He couldn't even think of a Bible verse if you put a gun to his head and asked him to think of one. But his support is largely, he's seen as, I think that's another factor here that is different than Reaganism, is that he is seen as a figure chosen by Yahweh to create a Christian renaissance in America. And it's become a folk religion. And I don't think it's going to stop with his death. I mean, however he dies, he will be a martyr to this new folk religion that's always been brewing under the surface of America. With the John Birch Society, people have forgotten about that. A lot of
Robert Welch, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the John Birch Society was no less crazy than QAnon. That, saying that Dwight Eisenhower is a dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy, that kind of thing, and thinking was going on a long time ago. I think we talked about it in one of our previous interviews, the Paranoid Style in American Politics, that book, which I think came out in '64, describes what's going on. But I was going to say real quick. Yeah.
If I could, one of the big antecedents when I talk about Trump to people is, you mentioned Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, but as much as I mentioned Boss Tweed, I feel like he's a mix of Boss Tweed, P.T. Barnum, and then on the other end of that equation, this sort of know-nothing movement of the 1800s, that sort of populist nativist movement. There's definite schools of thought that Trump is either consciously or unconsciously pulling from that go back years.
Oh, yes, definitely. I see the parallel, but I don't think he's drawing on anything. I don't think he knows enough about history to even do that. But he is definitely a mixture of the know-nothings of Barnum for sure. I mean, your description of him as a carnival barker, that's what he is. He's the con man on, on the caravan pulling into town and selling snake oil, as I said before. And people love P.T. Barnum. And again, and I see L. Ron Hubbard as part of that tradition. Um, yeah, but this kind of populism has been in America for a very long time, and the anti-intellectualism that's what people admire about him. His quote, "I love the uneducated." There's no other Western industrial country where that kind of statement would be applauded except America, which valorizes and admires ignorance and stupidity as being plain spoken and down to earth and somehow more real than, the hatred of experts, the hatred of authority, the hatred of history, the hatred of knowledge, the hatred of facts, the hatred of critical thinking. This anti-intellectualism that's de Tocqueville noted it in his travels in America a very long time ago as a fundamental problem of American anti-thought.
You mentioned the concept of the demiurge earlier. If I have listeners that aren't familiar with that, why are you comparing QAnon and MAGA to sort of a demiurgic impulse?
Yeah, for those of your listeners who may not know, the demiurge in the Gnostic schools of Christianity, which I ascribe to personally and practice, believe that Yahweh, the God of the Jews and the Christians of the Old and New Testament, is not the true creator of the universe, but a kind of narcissistic imposter, a cruel and ignorant lower spirit, a tyrant, actually called Ealdaboth, the being that is worshipped by the Abrahamic religions as Yahweh, is a destructive, imposter god who has his followers under a spell because he lives off of bloodshed and violence. And I mean, that would get into a huge digression, but read the Old Testament and the New Testament, especially the Old Testament, and look at this homicidal creature. As Mark Twain said, if man is created in his image, then God is a psychopath. So the demiurge is this imposter God. And I should point out, I do believe it exists. I am not an atheist. I do believe that Yahweh exists and he is a malevolent God. And I think that when MAGA supporters look at Trump as this God chosen being, yes, I do believe he is a creature of the demiurge, chosen to make the demiurgic form of Abrahamic tyranny great again. I believe that. And I think what's happening in Israel is a part of that. And I think Trump's Zionist support of the genocide of the Palestinians through his friend Netanyahu, which he will support completely, even though Arabs crazily voted for him, voted for the destruction of their Muslim brothers, basically. So I see a lot of what's going on in the world as demiurgic activity, the activity of Israel. And you can be sure that Trump will support that because of his own Zionism and his extreme Zionist base, his connection to the Kushners. We can go on and on about
Miriam
that. But to me, it's
Adelson. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. And isn't it's hilarious too, these neo-Nazis that think Trump is going to be their great white hope, this Zionist who's done more for Israel than any other president and has promised to do even more for them. Do they know who, on one hand, they hate George Soros. Do they know who Adelson is even? They better, but they don't. They cherry pick what they want to create this delusive idea of a Messiah. So yeah, that I do not look at this from a political perspective, personally, I look at it as a spiritual issue that Trumpism and Netanyahu and this sort of thing going on in the world is very much a manifestation of the demiurge. And I see MAGA as that, a kind of bizarro world distortion of the teaching of Christ, which of course it really has nothing to do with. Under the guise of being Christianity, this demonic and malevolent force, which of course they consider themselves to be the enemy of the demonic. That's the irony of it. But that's very often how the demiurge works. It presents itself as the ultimate good, where it itself is actually malevolent.
One thing that I've heard from conservative friends of mine, and I mean conservative, sort of the dissident sort of conservatives, people that write for publications like the American Conservative or Compact Magazine. These people, I'm not going to name names, but they'll say to me things like, "I don't really like Trump either. I think he's crass and crude, but he's a way to get us closer to what we want." And my response to that has always been, Trump himself is so debased and degenerate. He is more or less a con man, casino magnate. And I mean, if that is the person that is going to save the right wing or save conservatism or save whatever their idea is of traditionalism, he can't do that because he himself is too debased to be able to do that. In other words, it's almost like the cause is lost to begin with.
I agree with you completely. I am not adverse to conservative and traditionalist ideas whatsoever. I don't like wokeism. I see wokeism and MAGA as flip sides of the same coin. I see them that they both come from the same basic foundation. I reject both of them. I do not understand why any conservative would see this sleazy, New York elite, failed TV show host. When you say casino magnate, how can you, this brilliant businessman can't even make money with a casino? Even that failed, along with Trump Steaks and Trump College. He's a failed businessman. He represents everything that any genuine Christian would be repelled by. And yet I see the defense of him is that, God chose him anyway. They chose a man of sin like King David. I've actually seen these weird justifications and rationalizations. But that's part of the evangelical movement to, think of how many of the Christian leaders in the moral majority and in the later evangelical born again movement have been caught in sex scandals and been totally disgraced. And yet that's part of it, is then to love them for their sin and to accept it. So yeah, I do not understand why any true conservative would see this sleazy con man as any kind of conservative. Look at his mentor, Roy Cohn, and how many of the people that support him, Roy Cohn is. I assume your listeners would, or at least they can easily find out. How could anyone look at that vile creature and think that the disciple of Roy Cohn is anything to emulate, to make anything great again? It's astonishing to me. Yeah, but I don't get it at all. Why would conservatives choose this person who is clearly not any representative of any conservative values? I agree.
You mentioned the brokenness of the American male, and I wanted to touch on that because I agree with you. I've been thinking about doing. I've already recorded a show that I have to release on the fact that Trump got a lot of male votes in both elections. And now we're seeing black male votes and Latino votes going to Trump, Latino male votes going to Trump. There is something, I think, to what you're saying. There is sort of this brokenness. Can you speak more to that?
Well, I mean, Joe Rogan, who I detest, I should point out, again, that's what passes for a public intellectual in modern American culture. His support, I think, had a lot to do with his victory. And I see, I see this with young American men are very confused about their sexuality. They look at females, which is what they call them, females, not women, as almost an alien species that they don't understand. They fear them, they hate them. Incredible groundswell of misogyny in American males. Look at Andrew Tate. I saw recently. Again, let me make it clear. I think he's a completely vile. Again, another showman and con man and
real quick, what's
yeah,
amazing since you mentioned Andrew Tate. I mean,
yeah,
again, this is I think you and I probably have some differing political beliefs, Nicholas, but we can both look at Andrew Tate and the man is a pimp. I mean, he is
yeah,
a pimp. He is a degenerate pimp. And yet
right.
this man is being held up as a mentor,
Well,
by these young people. Yeah.
exactly. Well, after and this, uh, I'm sure this will be controversial, but why did so many black young men vote for Trump? Because he's like Superfly. He's pimp-like. And what is rap music and hip hop glorified for years? And certainly I know there's plenty of black people who do not emulate that, the gangster pimp player lifestyle, but Andrew Tate represents that, and Trump does too. He's seen as a pimp who controls his hoes, you know, and bitches, and that has permeated American culture. That kind of Andrew Tate thinking that women are bitches and hoes to be controlled, and shut them up, control them. I mean, one of the most absurd things that Andrew Tate said recently is that loving your wife is gay. That you got to stop it. It takes your breath away, the sheer stupidity and hypocrisy of that kind of statement. So I think a lot of what's going on in America is this seething, incel mistrust of women, hatred of women. It is, they call it feminism, but they don't even know what feminism is. They literally are confused and fearful of female sexuality, of female independence, of female power. And I think that has a huge part to play in what's going on. You see that with Jordan Peterson, with Andrew Tate, Tucker Carlson. And weirdly, there's something very homophiliac about it all, despite their outward disdain for homosexuality. Looking at it from an outside perspective, it seems like very closeted, protesting too much behavior. So yeah, that's that. I mean, the idea that Trump is a strong man, that he's a manly man. I don't know if you see him that way, but I look at his whining and bitching and complaining, and somebody said he's a weak man's idea of a strong man. I don't even see him representing any kind of virility or strength, and yet that's the delusive aura around him, which is typical of the demiurge, to see something that's not there. But I think this transcends politics. It is a hatred of the female, which is intrinsic in Abrahamic religion. If anyone bothers to read the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's all about the evil of women, of Eve, of Jezebel, of Lilith, of all these horrendous female beings that poor innocent men are beset and bewitched by. And I think that's a deep part of the problem.
It's interesting. I noticed you referenced Jordan Peterson there. He's another one that I just look at him and I'm like, what? I don't understand the appeal, especially to Christians, because to me he just comes off as almost like Christianity, but for postmodernists. Like his whole interpretation of religion is really rooted in this idea of, well, we need religion. It's not like, it feels like he has a postmodern interpretation of the faith. I don't see
Right.
him as like, well, go on.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying, yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I don't understand it either. But that's how they fit Trump into it. He's certainly not a Christian, but he espouses Christian gestures. He holds the Bible upside down, and therefore it's Christian. So, I mean, all these people. Musk has said he was a cultural Christian. Obviously, he doesn't believe in the supernatural or any of the mystical aspects of Christianity. But that's actually that's a whole other part of it. Is this weird carnival barker Christianity that's come out of it? Russell Brand praying with Tucker Carlson and doing these very corny revival show type religious rallies. That's a big part of what led to Trump's election, I think, of them praying for him. I mean, Russell Brand is another figure like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. These, and they all sort of vaguely, I've described it as broistism, this kind of pseudo-stoicism.
That's interesting, the pseudo-stoicism that you're referring to there.
Right. So there's a weird mixture of pagan stoicism and pseudo-Christianity that all of those people have in common. Tate, Rogan, Peterson, Carlson, these anti-intellectuals that are the vanguard of the conservative movement today. There are two other things I wanted, in many of the things you pointed out about. You were saying that to the satanic panic conspiracists and QAnon people, anything that is not their version of evangelical Christianity is demonic or satanic. I can vouch for that. I wanted to point out, I've been a tantric Buddhist longer than I was a devil worshiper, and these people find that even more frightening and sinister than Satanism. They look at Buddhism as the true evil. So I can totally vouch for that anything that is not evangelical Christianity is evil to them. I've seen that firsthand.
And there was another point you said you wanted to bring up?
Well, no, I did want to return to Wally George. I think that's important too. We've drifted way far away from him.
I know. This tends to happen sometimes when we talk.
Right.
With Wally George, I guess, I mean, I'd be more, I'm what was the real Wally George like? Because I know you bonded over music. I think you were, and as I am, a fan of Les Baxter, and he also was as well, to my understanding.
Yeah, well, when I got to know him backstage and when I would run into him in Hollywood at, concerts and entertainment events and that kind of thing, he started out I mean, he was deeply entrenched in the music world of LA. And so he was a big fan of exotica music, of Lex Baxter, who I actually worked with on a film I was going to make. I encouraged him to come out of retirement to write one last soundtrack, but unfortunately that film never happened. Martin Denny, Wally and I both liked, and he was a big fan of the Beach Boys and particularly Brian Wilson's composition. And he was knowledgeable about music. I mean, he was a failed musician who never quite made it. He did record a few singles in the 60s, which you can find online. We got along immediately as soon as we met. He understood what I was doing. I understood what he was doing. We never really had a conscious discussion about it, but he could not have been friendlier backstage. Completely the opposite of what our relationship on camera was. And the funny thing is, we never discussed it. We never even commented on that. It was just just a given that, of course, I'm the adversary and you're the good guy, and we'll play that part, even though that is true, but we exaggerated that aspect of our personality. But we never planned anything. He was very affable. He was very friendly. He was eccentric for sure. He was very distractible. But I think he was a decent person ultimately. Although I know there were accusations lobbed at him of some sexual harassment of women he worked with at the channel he worked with. I know that his wives had problems with him, and there's got to be a good reason that Rebecca De Mornay his daughter was estranged from him. I've heard rumors and that kind of thing, but I don't want to speculate. But I mean, I think maybe privately he was a troubled man, possibly domestic violence, maybe lecherous with co-workers. That kind of thing seems possible. I never saw any sign of it, but I had heard rumors of that. But privately, I got along with him fine, as I did privately with Geraldo. When I met Geraldo alone, he was personable, intelligent, self-deprecatory, humorous. But then, when the cameras were on, he played that asshole Geraldo Rivera character he created. So I've seen that a great deal with media figures, that it's all, and that's why I don't really do much mainstream media anymore. I mean, I recently agreed to do for NBC Peacock an interview about my friendship with Richard Ramirez, but it seemed like a much more intelligent and in-depth and a little more thoughtful than the usual sensationalist thing. But that was my experience with all of the media, is that they very consciously, they needed me to be a villain, but they treated me, perfectly fine. Like for these talk shows I would do, they'd give you a per diem, they give you a driver, they give you the best hotel in town, they take you to dinner, they wine and dine you, they treat you courteously, and then you go in and are you put in the hot seat and treated as the villain, and then when it's over, it's just all show business, and that's why I just don't participate in that anymore. That was a very good lesson in how unreal television is, how much of it is play acting and theatricality.
That's a really interesting point, because in a weird way, I almost feel like there's points where I almost want to defend Wally George, in the sense of I think he was a talented entertainer, and I do think it took talent to do what he did. I mean,
Yeah.
to tap into that psychology and to get the crowd going, there's a talent to that. And I also think, in a weird way, someone like Wally George was almost more honest about what he was doing than I think some of the people that have come since. What I mean by that is, I think there's always a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We know that this is like, a crazy carnival spectacle with someone like Wally
Right.
George, or even a Morton Downey Jr. Whereas today's sort of types, like a Tucker Carlson, for example, act like they're serious intellectuals, or even on the liberal end, a Rachel Maddow. I think that
Right.
these are all entertainers, but they act as if they're doing something oh so important for the intellectual discourse. Whereas, at least with Wally George, you knew what you were getting.
Well, I think he was a natural showman. He knew how to entertain. I don't think he had a methodology or a plan or a strategy. I think that became his act. I think he would have preferred to be a musician, definitely, and he just ended up as Sam Yorty's henchman, and then inherited this TV show, and it took off, and he knew how to play it. But I don't think, he was just a natural performer and showman, and he knew how to entertain. And yeah, he had a talent. Look, we're still talking about him years after his death. He's definitely probably far more known now than he was in his lifetime. I think YouTube has made him even more well known and popular. But he was a decent person compared to what's come after, even though I definitely do see the comparison, and I'm not denying the dark side of the lynch mob rabble rousing that he did. It definitely was potentially dangerous, and it was connected to the kind of threatening behavior that I dealt with during the Satanic Panic. I mean, it was a very violent time. This is too, but it had a different tone, and he definitely contributed to it. I mean,
Did he
if it's
ever?
irresponsible.
I'm just curious. Did he ever get in on things like the McMartin case, or commenting on that kind of thing, or?
No, he
Okay.
didn't. I don't recall him ever talking about that. Privately, we did not talk about politics in any way. We talked about music. We talked about, culture, pretty much, really mostly music. I mean, he did, in a weird way, he was going out of his way to support me. He wanted, he knew that he was doing that. I mean, Radio Werewolf was based on notoriety, not popularity. So he was feeding that, and he very consciously did that. If he didn't,
He
he
knew
wouldn't
he'd
keep
found the
inviting us.
perfect villain.
Yeah. Exactly. And he was the perfect adversary for us. So, it was a symbiotic relationship. But yeah, I don't think he was conscious of what he was doing. Some people are just natural performers, and he was for his particular. But a lot of people watched the show who were liberals or had no political views. They were just entertained by it. And that too, I think, is something in common with the stable genius. There's a lot of people who don't really care about his policies or what the consequences of what might happen in Ukraine or Gaza because of him. They just think, well, he's funny, he's entertaining. I mean, and that's enough for them that he's entertaining. I think that that's something that they have in common is I think people ignore the policies they're speaking of, and I don't know that Wally would actually have supported Trump. I think
He strikes me as the type of guy that maybe in 2016 would have been a promoter of Ted Cruz. I don't know who he would have supported in 2020, but
well, yeah, I think he would have. I think he would have supported the what the Trump supporters would see as rhinos, Republicans in name only. I think he would have looked more at the older Nixonian. I mean, it's funny. Nixon wrote a letter to Trump, which was probably just like a polite little thing he did, saying, Pat saw you on TV, and I thought, and she said, this guy should go into politics, and I agree. And Trump framed that, and that was a big inspiration for him to go into politics. But I don't think Richard Nixon would have supported Trump. I think Nixon was a more decent and ethical person than Donald Trump. I and obviously knew a hell of a lot more about history and statesmanship and the world than he ever did. So, but of course, the MAGA movement, I think, would probably reject Nixon as being too liberal with his weird tree saving ideas about founding, the environmental agency, which now Trump is dismantling. So that would be looked at as liberal now.
Well,
Nixon.
even in a weird way, I always tell people Nixon was kind of the last Republican to believe in some version of the welfare state. I mean, in a way, he was the most left-leaning, in some ways, Republican we've had. I mean, it's been different since Reagan.
Well, Nixon was not tied only to ideology, and if you look at some of his interviews after his presidency, they're just practical. They're pragmatic. He looked at what would be the right policies. He was not a rabid ideologue by any means compared to what's come after it. And he's like, that's Nixon's administration is Plato's Republic compared to what's happened after that, as crooked and corrupt as he absolutely was, ordering burglaries from the Oval Office, but how mild that is compared to the things Trump has been impeached for and convicted for. I mean, it's quite incredible.
I'm curious in terms of when you would go on air on the hot seat with Wally George. It was very improvisational. How did you get into the role, so to speak? Because you sort of had to, I guess, amplify your own personality. And I mean, it could get very heated. I know that at one point you made the joke to Wally on air that Radio Werewolf was going to initiate Rebecca De Mornay, and I guess he got all purple in the face.
Right. That was he had a radio show that went on for hours called The Great American Radio Show with Wally George, and after the TV appearances, he invited us onto that with a Christian preacher whose name I don't recall. So the Christian preacher was, it couldn't have been better. He was saying, I'm more evil than Jim Jones, Hitler, Manson, etc. He couldn't have played his role better. But yeah, I said flippantly to Wally George when he was asking about the Radio Werewolf youth party that we initiated Rebecca De Mornay, because whenever I'm interviewed by someone, I do some research about them to think of you know, what would be a good point to bring up at that time that would be aggravating or irritating. So I thought that would be sensitive because I knew she had broken with him and was estranged from her father. So he turned bright red, and he was truly angry, not theatrically angry at that point.
I guess though, how did you like play off the energy, so to speak? I mean, because it sounds like on air it's very different. How do you get into that? Does it just turn on when he is interviewing you, or how does that work?
Well, like I said, Wally wasn't that different in private. He was a little more vehement and a little louder, but that was his personality. And I wasn't really that different than I was on air in my everyday life. And so when you're a performer and an entertainer, as I have been, really since my teenage years in theater and that kind of thing, that's what I come from. So it just comes naturally if you're a performer, and I think we had that in common. We knew exactly. We never planned it. We never thought about what we're going to do. It just worked. It's like having it's like when you're doing improv, you have a partner who knows exactly how to play off of you. So we were a good team in that way, and definitely we were supporting each other. And afterwards, every time, he couldn't have been more thrilled. He thanked us for being on. The ratings were good. He was very happy to do so.
Before we start wrapping up, is there anything else you want to say about Wally George? And then maybe we could come back to Trump before we close out.
Right. Well, I think that he was ultimately a show business figure who found an act that worked for him. And I don't think I don't think that's what he wanted to be. I personally think that he wasn't really happy with just being limited to being Mr. Conservative. I think he liked being famous. I think he liked having the attention of young women and celebrity and being admired and all of that. But I think he would have been happy to do that in any other way. And I got a kind of between the lines subconscious feeling that would not have been the career he chose, but it because it was popular, he went with it. Like, if an actor is cast in a sitcom, and you're Fonzie for the rest of your life, you may not have chosen to be that, but you are. And I see him more as completely an entertainment figure who played the part of Mr. Conservative. But he was friendly to everybody. He knew all kinds of liberals and hippies and drug dealers and homosexuals and porn stars and people that most conservatives would think were the scum of the earth. I never saw him be anything but courteous and civil to any of those people, or people he disagreed.
I think I read an interview. Well, go on. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and even people he disagreed to who were more right-wing than him, though maybe that's not really true, but Tom Metzger, he argued with him quite forcefully, and but he was always polite and cordial to everybody. He never treated anyone personally off the air with contempt. And so he hung around people like that. He knew rock musicians. He didn't judge people. He was not, he treated everyone decently. I have to say, I never saw him be cruel or unpleasant to anyone, even people he was ideologically opposed to.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember reading an interview that you gave in Dangerous Minds where, you had brought in some, I guess, maybe groupies with you to a hot seat taping, and Wally eventually had them on his show later on.
Right. At that time, we had sort of a mini commune, and these two girls came with me, and yeah, one of them was my main girlfriend at the time, and he was so intrigued by that. Well, that's a perfect example. He didn't judge us at all. He thought, really, you all live together, and that he was asking, how does that work? I mean, there was no such word as polyamory at that point, and we didn't think of it that way, but. So he was talking to us backstage. Well, how does that work? How do you live together? As a kind of communal romantic relationship. And then he invited them on to talk about it. I haven't been able to find that video, but yeah, he had them both on to talk about what is a group marriage and how can that work. So he was, of course he acted like it was horrific and obscene on the air, but privately he was intellectually curious about it and was very friendly to them.
Do you think that helped him along in his career? Just it sounds like, from what I've heard from people that knew Wally George, that it sounds like he was a very charming person, or could be a very charming person behind the scenes. And I assume his
Absolutely.
affability and sort of taking an interest in other people really allowed him to, being a people person helped him in his career, is what I'm getting at.
Absolutely. No, he was genuinely curious and interested. Even if he thought your ideas were insane, he would privately talk to many people about them. He knew a lot of people in the music world who obviously did not share his Reaganite conservative values, and he got along with them perfectly well. He was extremely charming, very cheerful, very genuine and sincere off the air. So I think it was a part he was playing, but it definitely, I mean, I'm sure Trump is charming in person, obviously, some people may hate him, but I've heard that people I know who met George W. Bush said he was charming and he could see why he was likable and why his career worked. But charm alone doesn't mean a damn thing, that there's lots of horrible, malevolent, charming people. Many narcissists are very charming, but I think he was curious about other people, and of course, in the entertainment world or in politics world, that's necessary. I think
So
he made.
it sounds like, real quick, it sounds like he was
Yeah,
genuinely curious, as opposed to the type of, because I think there are people in show business that will feign having an interest in someone else and their ideas just to use them to get something. It sounds like he knew that he was using his guests to get ratings, but it sounds like he was like genuinely affable as well. It wasn't just a narcissistic thing necessarily.
yeah, absolutely. He liked the admiration. He liked having these young idiots admire him and chant his name, and being this kind of cult figure. And also, I think an important thing about him, and this is a strange thing about the whole Republican thing, I think he probably knew more. I think in his social life, he probably knew more rock musicians and drug addicts and liberals and, radicals and misfits than conservatives, the people he hung around with. Um, I think he liked provoking them. And I think he wouldn't really know what to do if he was only around other conservatives who agreed with him. I think he fed off of the provocative nature of what he was doing. So there was almost like a punk rock transgressive delight in shocking liberals around him with his conservative ideas, which is a big part of MAGA. Like, I think that attitude continues in a more poisonous way with MAGA, in that do they really care if Trump can govern properly? He clearly can't. They don't care if he achieves the things he claims he's going to achieve. They only care that the libs are owned, that the libtards are offended, that the woke are, crying about him. So it's a very unpragmatic way of looking at politics. They don't. I mean, and this is why you can't call Trump a fascist or a national socialist. They weren't interested in just offending their opponents. They had a program and a plan and an ideology they intended to institute for 1,000 years, and it was a very clear and coherent program. I don't know if you agree, but it just seems to me like just being provocative, just making insulting one-liners and getting a laugh is sufficient to get support now.
No,
You know, they
I
don't
think
really.
you're absolutely right about that. I think there's been a real decline in intellectual discourse. You know, even these issues that are hot culture war topics, like the whole trans issue. I think there are interesting conversations that come out of thinking about that. What I mean is, you know, if you believe in the liberal tradition, in a lot of ways, I could see why uh, young kids would support the idea of, oh, choose your own gender identity, because
Right.
it is very liberal. Like John Gray, the British philosopher, has called it the uh, logical conclusion of liberalism, and we can agree or disagree on, you know, the culture war issue, but we can have thought-provoking conversations about, well, is there a limit to liberalism? Isn't there? But no one wants to have those conversations. No one wants to have conversations about, well, how do we, you know, work with this group in society? You know, how do we integrate these people that are marginal, or like,
Right.
there's no thought put into any of this. It's sort of like everyone is scripting now. Everything is a wrestling match, whether it's mainstream media or the YouTube, Twitch media. There's no intellectual heft to any of
I
these
agree.
conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I have not been in America much since 2019, and even before that, hardly at all. And I returned recently to be filming some of these documentaries I'm making for my film production company. And so I had many discussions with all kinds of Americans. And to underscore and underline your point, I was amazed at how both quote liberals and quote conservatives, they aren't thinking. They just repeat pat knee-jerk party line bullshit. They're not actually thinking about anything. They have been given the talking points, and if you question them about them, it's like a doll that has a pre-programmed recording in it. They say exactly what you would expect them to say. I found very little intellectual depth in Americans on either side of the culture wars. You know, if I debated, you know, what may be wrong with the Democratic Party with supporters of Harris, you know, they would just spout the same party line stuff. They wouldn't go any deeper into it. And same with the MAGA people. You know, the problem is that it seems like both sides don't know the difference between propaganda and actually thinking through an issue from your own personal perspective. They just repeat propaganda. I
It's
found it
become a religion
shocking
for some
and
people.
alarming. And well, as I touched on before, I think this is not a political phenomenon. This is not another political phenomenon. The deep roots in the Christian evangelical thinking, into QAnon, into the conspiracy thinking that lays behind Trumpism, is a folk religion that has been developing for quite a long time in America. He is the symptom of a much deeper disease. He's just a temporary, you know, canker sore on the face of that disease, but it's not going to go away. It's America. It is the heartland, and they have been emboldened and they've been allowed to express what used to be inexpressible. The most insane delusional thinking has now become mainstream. So yeah, that's it. It is a folk religion that is forming, and that's why I don't have any illusion that it can be defeated. I don't think it's going to change. I think it's going to be a permanent part of America, and I think it's going to lead to the collapse of the empire completely, because it is not rooted in reality. It's, you know, anything that is not rooted in actual fact and reality is going to lead to fragmentation and destruction. And I think that's what's going to happen. If you have millions of people who believe things that are, you know, alternative facts, in the immortal words of Kellyanne Conway. Where can that lead if you're disconnected from reality? And I must say, of course, many of the beliefs of the so-called extreme left, I don't even dignify them to actually say that they are leftists. Whatever they are, the woke people on the other extreme are equally delusional in what they believe. Both of them are. And I again stress, I don't really see that either the left or the right in the United States as it stands really have anything to do with the historical definitions of left and right. They've mutated into some bizarre. I mean, why are Americans so completely obsessed with politics? That's all they care about.
That's what I was getting at, Nicholas, is I think some people, it used to be the hipster kids would be into obscure bands, right? Maybe they'd be into Radio Werewolf. Now the hipster kids are listening to obscure political Twitch streamers. We have political junkies that aren't even educated about politics or history, and now it's become politics isn't just, it's not even politics anymore. It's an identity.
No.
It's a religion for people. It forms the core of who they are. It's a brand, and it's not political anymore. It's not even engaging in political work or activism or doing anything to change anything.
Exactly. That's what I mean. They don't care about governance. They don't care about real programs that pragmatically work and are seen, whatever they may be, whatever you think is the right way to govern, they don't care. But that is now, me as a child of the 60s, I thought, I can't think of anything more square, less culturally interesting than a politician. To me, that I was raised to believe politicians are just professional liars who are not worth listening to from any area whatsoever, whether left or right. There was a time when politicians were considered like used car salesmen of absolutely no value. And it's very disturbing. America's total lack of interest in culture, in music, in literature, in cinema, anything that is a civilizing and ennobling force, or even gets people to think about their interior lives, is completely lacking in America. Why are young people interested in congressmen and senators, these vile liars on both sides of the aisle? Why is that fascinating to people? You tell me. I have no idea. I can't think of anything less interesting and less worth listening to than a politician of any kind. I don't know how it happened. I've been away from America for a long time, but yes, exactly. Why do these people listen to podcasts about this sort of pseudo-political culture war issues endlessly? It's all they care about. And I found that every topic in America, as an outsider who's lived in Europe most of my adult life, what you eat, what you wear, where you go, what neighborhood you're in, what car you drive, everything is ideology permeates every single choice in America. I was astonished by that. People are not individuals. They have these cookie cutter identities, as you said, like avatars on the internet. And there's nothing ever surprises you about them. They go down the party line all the way. They never say, well, I think this about this issue and that about that. No, they go completely by the party line. And yeah, it's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
I like that comparison. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, indeed. What's interesting is, in a weird way, Wally George almost seems quaint in comparison. I was reading a Dangerous Minds article about Wally George. It was one in addition to the interview you did with Dangerous Minds, where they were talking about Wally George was debating someone on date rape, and he was on the side of date rape is wrong. But now you have these Andrew Tate characters that I wouldn't be surprised if he says date rape's fine, and that's like the voice of conservatism in America now.
Well, Nick Fuentes, this repulsive incel turd, his phrase immediately after the election that spread virally all over the internet, your body, my choice. What is that saying? That is basically an exoneration of rape, which other vile people who I once have known have also acclaimed. So yeah, I mean, basically, like you said, Andrew Tate is pushing a pimp persona, and it is basically saying women belong to us. That's the problem. Women had the idea of leaving the kitchen and the nursery to become independent beings. Leaving aside feminism, because I'm also not, a traditional feminist by any means, but they literally do not want the autonomy of women. So rape is the ultimate claiming of their right as the dominion over women, which is at the heart of the whole trad wife fetish, that this sort of Stepford wife fantasy. And it is a fetish. They won't admit it, but that's what it is. And if you're into that, if it's consensual, fine, go for it. But it's rooted in something very misogynistic, and I agree with you. Now, I don't know what Wally was like in his private life. Like I said, I heard some rumors of domestic abuse and that kind of thing, and harassment of women. But at least publicly, he certainly would not. He had the idea of most of a decent Christian, of chivalry, of treating women with dignity and respect. I never heard him say anything, misogynistic to the degree that you find in the broistism movement of the manosphere. I agree with you. He would not have supported that.
Yeah, I mean, the figures we have now are even more outlandish in a lot of ways than Wally George.
Yeah, no, he's quaint and archaic and almost too civil. Yeah, I think most MAGA people, they might agree with some of his pioneering lib owning, but I think they would find him too much of a rhino, and a neocon and the other smear words they use for the old school Republicans that they no longer approve of. And the Republican Party has really nothing to do with the Republican Party that used to be. Certainly not the party of Lincoln, as they bizarrely claim it to be, and not the party of Reagan or Nixon or even George W. Bush. This is a whole other mutation.
I think
yeah,
for me for me, Trump, if we were to give a word for it in terms of governance, I think that we're going to get caucustocracy, government by incompetence or government by shit, as some people put it.
yeah,
I mean that's what it is. To me, I don't even use the word fascism. It's just caucustocracy, incompetence.
No, fascism was extremely well organized. They had a plan. There was a system. It was extremely rigidly, there were points that had to be achieved. There was ideology. There were principles, whether you agree with them or not. They were principles, and they were enacted efficiently, extremely efficiently for the most part. Yes, as you see, he's naming rank amateurs. I come from a military family. I know what the bureaucracy of the Department of Defense is like, and the intelligence agencies. Naming these rank amateurs, they're not going to be able to do shit with those people. Those bureaucrats are not going to cooperate with them, and they will have no idea how to do it. I mean, that's I think a lot of people who fear what will happen may be surprised by, as you said, how incredibly incompetent. If the level of intellectual nadir of the people that he's choosing, they're total amateurs, incompetents who have no experience in their field. So I think it's going to be a chaotic free for all. I'd be very surprised if they can achieve many of their goals, because they're going to be. I mean, of course, this is speaking to their argument about the deep state, but I don't think these entrenched bureaucracies and the intelligence agencies and the Department of Defense are going to bow down to some amateur telling them how to totally reorganize everything. I mean, Kennedy tried to do that. The deep state handled him, So there's that.
Well, I wanted to go back to something I said earlier, and I wasn't necessarily wording it too well, but I guess my issue is with all these hot button topics in America that people, debate over, no one actually thinks about what their principles are. For example, I was discussing with someone the issue of protesting and boycotting. And I was
Right.
discussing it from a freedom of association, freedom of speech lens. So it wasn't even political. I was like, if you want to boycott something, you have your right to do that. And I was,
Mm-hmm.
this other person was arguing with me saying, well, it's an extreme notion to boycott something. And I said, no, an extreme notion is picking up a Molotov cocktail and doing the Haymarket riots. Um,
Right.
you know, and they couldn't even conceive of this because to them, you know, it's only, well, whose team am I on?
Right.
Whose team are you on? I was thinking of it from principles. They're thinking of it as, oh, were you on team red or team blue? And to me,
Right.
that represents a kind of rot where people don't think in terms of what's my first principles. They think in terms of, are you team MAGA? Or are you team Kamala? Are you team Democrat? Are you team blue? It's
Well,
very bizarre to me. I think it's a rot in American discourse.
I have always detested professional sports. The only kind of sports I've ever done have been individual, like swimming and fencing were the only things I did in school and learned. Because I think at the root of that is America's obsession with team sports. And I think that's what politics has turned into, this bizarre mixture of evangelical Christianity, us versus them, but also team sports, us versus them. We're on this team. We're going to kill the other team. We're going to demolish the other team. I think what you're talking about is directly rooted to the American love of team sports and being on the team. And you don't have to think anymore. You just have to wear the right jersey, the right colors. It's a gang tribal mentality. And that's very deeply rooted in American anti-culture is what team are you on? Um, no, there are no ethical foundational. I mean, look at Watergate. George Bush, hardly the most ethical person in the world, uh, told Richard Nixon, "Look, you have to resign. We can no longer accept what we now know you have done." With that, he had some sort of ethical principles, or at least pragmatically and politically realized that had to be done at that time, because America did not accept a crook for their president at that time. Now they do. That's a huge turning of the tide. Now it's perfectly okay to be a criminal, an adjudicated rapist, you know, and all of the many other things he's been. Um, so, even someone like George Bush, who is, ethically vile in many ways, had some sort of principles. And I agree with you, there are no principles anymore. Like the people who were involved with the January 6th insurrection, they were the same people who didn't like Black Lives Matter, and I don't either. I don't like either. But what is the difference between the civil unrest of Black Lives Matter and the January 6th insurrection? There is no difference. It's mob rule. And that's what America is drifting into. Just random violence for its own sake. It's like they're bored with conventional governance. And this is part of America's mythology of the revolutionary, of the frontiersman, of the lone guy with the gun, the hero. And I think America's legend being based in the American Revolution, which really wasn't a revolution, it was a tax revolt of greedy landowners who wanted to maintain slavery and not pay taxes to Britain. I think that revolutionary idea doesn't make America a governable place. If you keep, if the whole foundation of a nation is based on mistrust of government, how can you ever have any kind of governable country?
The other thing I wanted to mention to you was I like that you brought up, first off, I want to say I like that you brought up the sort of image of the old Western rugged individualist hero, because that ties back to Wally George, because I know he was a big fan of John Wayne, or at least he had that
Right,
picture of John Wayne.
right, exactly. John Wayne, who never saw combat in his life. I mean, that's America. A Hollywood actor playing a tough guy, playing a soldier, playing a cowboy. And
Another
that's what Ronald
similarity too
Reagan
with
was.
Reagan.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan was like a 10th rate John Wayne. You know, he was a B movie actor, basically, never really a matinee idol star, but good enough for the mafia and the people that chose him. I mean, I think it's really worth pointing out. Again, I pointed out the similarity. He was a familiar face, and on TV from Death Valley days, you know, he was the host of it, and it was exactly like The Apprentice. And I think Americans overthink these things, and just they voted for Hollywood celebrities who they knew being in their living rooms as a comforting um, visage and voice. I think that had a lot to do with it. I think that's it. The show, it's like this weird mixture of circus, team sports, and show business is what American politics has degenerated into. It has very little to do with governmental principles at all.
The very last thing I wanted to touch upon, and this is, I hope this isn't too um, out of left field, but a lot of the figures we've been talking about, including Wally George himself, but we mentioned the John Birch Society. We mentioned,
Hmm.
Trump. With Trump, there's people like Stephen Miller. I'm noticing that there's a pattern with California. Um, and a lot of these sort of cranky right wingers coming out of California, or quote unquote right wingers within the American
Right,
context.
right.
Do you have a theory as to why that is? Why is California such an epicenter for a lot
Yeah,
of like
well,
weird right wing? Yeah.
yeah, well, I think a perfect example of it was Ronald Reagan's governmental crusade in 1966 when he was the candidate for governor, and he ran on a pretty much anti-hippie program, and he made one-liners and jokes about hippies and promised to quell the counterculture that was developing. And his jokes about hippies is largely what got him into office. And I think, yeah, I think the kind of Stephen Miller grotesque uh, caricature of MAGAism it's like it is this troll mentality, because there's an idea that California is filled with, wokeism and liberalism, but actually I haven't found that to be true. Of course, there is some of it, but there's extremely paleo-conservative movement. I mean, like even in Hollywood, John Wayne and Bob Hope, Henry Fonda, many of the key figures in Hollywood were extremely conservative and Republican to the core. Um, Most of the leading figures of who founded the movie industry were Republicans and conservatives. So I think what you're talking about is they sense that, and so they form a troll-like reaction to antagonize what they see as the prevalent liberalism of California. I think that's why so many figures. I mean, even Richard Nixon came from an antagonistic attitude to what he saw as his native California being overly liberal when he ran against Helen Gahagan, and smeared her as a communist and that kind of thing. That's a very old trope. Is like Orange County is a part of Los Angeles or of Southern California that's extremely conservative, and they always see themselves as like an oasis against the liberal tide. So I think that's why you get these figures there, because they see themselves in active opposition to the supposed liberalism.
In closing, when it comes to Trump, I mean, I guess you don't have to be concerned about Trump because you're not in the U.S. But what do you think is most concerning about Trump? I mean, I do think many Europeans could be very worried about Trump, so I take that
Oh,
back. But
I am. As a European, one country away from Ukraine is just Poland, and I've been in Poland recently filming. I mean, I'm not going to get into this in any great depth, but and I understand that Republicans will see this as some bizarre conspiracy theory. I see Brexit and Trump and many other factors going on in the world as part of Putin's propaganda victory. I think Putin has pushed these things. I think people assume that Putin admires Trump, but on the contrary, he sees him as a useful idiot, a malleable, easy to flatter child who he can impress and flatter, and who knows what other, motivations and vested interests are there. So I'm extremely concerned about what a second administration what the geopolitical consequences will be in Europe, because he will certainly support Putin. And I don't, we don't know the full story yet of what their connection is, but I think this has been, the past years have very much been part of Putin's propaganda. I don't believe in actual collusion or that sort of thing, but I think Putin knows how stupid Americans are, and also how stupid the British were. He really pushed Brexit. His online army of bots and trolls definitely pushed these things to happen. And I saw even during the Obama administration how many intelligent people would say, "Oh, did you read this really interesting article about something?" And I'd say, "That sounds like bullshit. Where was that from?" "Oh, it's from this news agency, RT." And I'd say, "Do you know what RT means?" And they didn't. So yes, I think anyone in Europe has to be concerned that the victory of Trump is the victory of Putin.
Out of curiosity, what do you make about the American right wing's embrace of Putin? Because I've been extremely concerned about Russia, specifically since the invasion of Ukraine and the demands that Russia has concerning annexations of at least four
Right,
provinces. And people
right.
can debate NATO expansion in the 90s all they want in foreign policy, but I don't know how you can not be concerned when Russia is making maximalist demands about annexation, especially if it's, we're seeing the same thing with Israel wanting to annex the West Bank and basically doing it de facto.
Well, I can answer that question and that was supposed to be the last question, but obviously one thing leads to the next. Let's take Vance. Quite a long time ago, I noticed him long before the stable genius selected him as his successor. I noticed his hypocrisy on, let's give trillions to Israel to fight the Palestinians, but let's not give a penny to the Ukrainians. And all of that is deeply concerning. The Zionist agenda to support Israel, largely for apocalyptic, evangelical, Christian beliefs in the apocalypse and Armageddon, which is what it's really all about, which I'm very familiar with. That is deeply concerning. And obviously I hate to even call them right. I don't know what the hell they are. Whatever. Trump supporters, MAGA, the new form of the folk religion of Trumpism, which I can't even dignify to call right wing or anything. It's its own unique mutation. They fantasize in their deluded way, having never been to Russia, having never met Russians, having never known Russians, that's some kind of traditional Christian paradise where trad wives are obeying their husbands, where there are no transsexuals. They have this fantasy of Putin's Russia being this perfect conservative, ideal Platonic state. And again, it's rooted in the demiurgic idea that whatever they may think of Putin, at least he's supporting what they think are traditional values. And so it's tied into the evangelical Christianity, even though his form of it is the Orthodox Church. So again, I see it as a spiritual issue. It is, to me, that's part of the support generally of the demiurge, which I do not. I think if a Martian looked at it, what is the difference between what Netanyahu is doing and what Putin is doing? None. However, MAGA supporters think Israel is righteous, and of course they're our ally, and we should give them 90 trillion more to defeat the Palestinians. And but there should be this hypocrisy, peace in you. They want peace in Ukraine, which means handing Ukraine over to Putin. So yeah, there's a lot for Europeans to be concerned with. The tariffs that apparently MAGA people don't know what the word tariff means and what it will mean for American consumers. But yeah, Trump is going to be a problem for Europe in general. So yeah, anyone here has to be concerned about that. Anything that increases the power and credibility for Putin is a problem.
Well, I want to thank you again, Nikolas Schreck, for spending a good over 2 hours with me. I apologize for keeping you so long, but I always find our conversations very engrossing. So I think my listeners will appreciate it.
No, it was my pleasure. Your questions were thoughtful and wide-ranging, and we covered a lot of territory. So in closing, I would say, to sum it up, definitely Wally George was a seed of Trumpism, but it turned into something very different than what he was. But the thing to reflect on is this weird Republican phenomenon of hating show business, claiming that they hate entertainers and culture in general, and yet Reagan, Trump, and Wally George are definitely entertainers, carnival barkers, actors, performers, doing this very theatrical presentation. So that is something for people from every political persuasion to contemplate, the counterintuitive nature of that.
And is there anything you wanted to, is there anything you want to promote of your work?
Well, currently you can get the Manson file from Rough Trade. You can find that easily online. That's the new and revised ultimate edition of the Manson file. The Satanic Screen you can get from Head Press Books. That's available everywhere. A new revised edition of that, a book we have spoken about in the past. That would be sufficient for now. So thank you for inviting me and for your lively conversation.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you found my conversation with Nikolas Schreck fascinating. And as always, if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.